here we are with the final video in the series, getting our rocket into Substance Painter, baking out our maps, and just having kind of a quick overview of the Substance Painter interface and how this stuff works. So to start off with, we need to open up our file. I'm going to go to File, New, and we need to select our rocket low. So that's going to be the actual geometry that we're applying that to. I'm also going to check this box for create a texture set per UDIM tile. So I didn't create materials in Houdini, just the UDIM. So this will go ahead and set up my textures for me based on UDIM tiles. The document resolution I'm going to set to 2048. And depending on what you're going to ultimately be outputting this to, you may need to change your template. I'm going to leave this at the default PBR metallic roughness and click OK. And there we get our ship in here. Now, real quick, I'm going to reset this layout so that we can see what the default layout is in Substance Painter. You can navigate Substance Painter just like you can with Houdini and Maya. Hold Alt key, left click and drag to rotate, middle mouse button drag to pan, and right mouse click and drag to zoom in and out. Up at the top, we've got our file edit, mode, window, viewport, plugins, and most of these, with the exception of file, are kind of empty. There's not a whole lot going on here. And most of the UI is actually right visible straight off from the beginning, so we really don't need to worry about most of this stuff too much. This is not a particularly complicated software, and you'll notice it kind of looks like Photoshop actually, and really doesn't even have as many menus and stuff to dive into as Photoshop does. Up here we've got our brush size controls along the top. We also have things for like symmetry, and you can have radial symmetry, X symmetry, Y symmetry, etc. Over here we've got our view controls, so we can do 3D only or 2D and 3D, so we can actually see the UV layout that we set up in Houdini, or we can just do one at a time and then swap 3D and 2D. We can change our view from a perspective to orthographic view, so sometimes you might be painting something and you want to be able to look at it kind of flat on without any perspective distortion, so you can use orthographic views to do that. So perspective, it's always going to be a little bit twisted and a little bit distorted. We also have constrained rotation, so that's going to constrain kind of how it rotates around the model, which I'm just going to leave that on. Finally, we've got our little render tab here, which is the camera. Now, this renders much faster if you're on a computer with an NVIDIA GPU. Iray is an NVIDIA thing, so obviously it's going to work better with NVIDIA hardware. And as you can see, I'm rotating around this, and you can see it pretty much updates just instantly almost, because I have an NVIDIA GPU in my system. If you don't have a GPU at all, or you have an AMD GPU, this is not going to work particularly well, and you're going to be in CPU only mode, and every time you change something, you're going to have to wait just like any other renderer. Now, before we get into our menus over here, we'll really quickly look at our tools over here. So just like in Photoshop or Illustrator, you've got brush, eraser, you've got our projection tools, you've got smudge tools, stamp tools. You've also got, I think, to go ahead and pull in Substance Share materials from the Substance Share website. Photoshop files to export for Photoshop, and then just a few different other controls, like to send things to Substance Share or update resources if you're pulling files from like a Photoshop file or from Substance Share. Down here at the bottom we have our materials list, and the way that this works for the most part is that we're just using these smart materials that are kind of looking at some of the data that we're going to be baking, like curvature and ambient occlusion, to figure out where it should put kind of grunge or messy stuff or anything. Up here we've got our texture set list, and we've got layers. So for each texture set, we're going to have a different set of layers. We've also got texture set settings. So for each texture set here, we can change the settings. And these texture sets are literally created by the different UDIM tiles that we set up earlier. So 1001, for instance, is our fuselage. So we can go ahead and name that so we know what it is. 1002 is our set of fins that we created. So I'll double click on that and rename it. And then finally, this one here should be the engine, the bottom. And we can also change the different settings for these. So right now this is using the main shader, or we can also create new shader instances for these. So if we wanted to make a new shader that was different from the rest, we could point this to a new shader and then set up settings separately from the rest. For this, we're just going to leave all of these at the default. I'm not going to be changing any of those. We'll go ahead and add some layers here in a second, but for right now, you can see that this, again, looks a lot like Photoshop. We've got our layer with our little visibility, and we've got the blend modes for different layers. Right now it's on normal. We also have opacity for our different layers. Up here at the top, we've got some different layer control and layer addition settings. We can add masks, we can add fill layers, we can add paint layers, we can add different like smart materials and stuff. So this is actually a quick shortcut to get to some of the things that we have down here in the shelf. And then we also have adding folders so we can keep things organized in our trash. Properties, this is basically the properties of our materials, and I like to actually keep this over on the left so that I can see that stuff more easily rather than having it all stacked up over here. Now I can make the layers a little bit bigger. And with all of these, you can actually move them around and put them wherever you want. If you close one, it just goes over here on the right side. So that's what I meant about the layers are kind of always open. You can move them around, close them, and they'll just go right back over there to the right side. So even if you accidentally close one, it's just going to be over here. You can also open them all up too. You can dock them to different places and, just kind of play around with them. Or if it's something that you don't need all the time, like display settings, we can just keep this over here on the side. Display settings are handy. We have in Substance Painter environment lighting, so we can turn that environment map all the way up. If I use Shift and the right click and drag, we can rotate the environment map. We can also get rid of the environment blur too, so we can kind of see what it looks like at different angles. We can also change our environment map. So right now we've got this kind of western Colorado looking map. This here we've got one from the Mediterranean somewhere, it looks like. We also have like a bunch of these just kind of basic studio lighting setups, which aren't great. Like they don't give you a whole lot of detail in these really strong shadows. So I'm just going to leave this on whatever one of these basic kind of daylight shaders. Being able to hold Shift and right click and drag these really helps to be able to see the different colors on your object. You can also turn shadows on and off if you want. I just leave them off usually because they kind of get in the way. So those are display settings. We've got shader settings, so different shaders. Right now we're in the main shader, so if we wanted to change this, we could kind of enable other stuff. We could change its ambient occlusion intensity. Most of the stuff we're not going to get into here because we're just worried about the basics, getting some stuff into Substance Painter and adding height maps and normals to it. History lets us go back and change, go back through our history and get back to the beginning. And then, of course, we've got our log. So if something goes wrong, you can check the log. It'll tell you any errors, especially like if you're baking something and it doesn't work out. So I'm going to turn off the environment opacity. Notice the environment opacity, turning that off doesn't change the lighting. So even though we turned off the environment, the lighting is still the same and it's still controlled by the same environment. If I hold Shift and right click and drag, we can still rotate it around. All right, let's go ahead and start adding some materials to do that to this. But to do that, we first need to bake some information to this. Right now it's just kind of a very basic, very bland model. We don't have any details on it. We want to bring our creases back in. We want to bring our windows back in here. So I'm going to go to texture set settings and I want to bake mesh maps. So we can click on that. I'm going to change the resolution to 2048 so we get a little better resolution. You can crank this up to like a 4K texture, but it will probably slow your computer down. I'm going to click this button and point this to the rocket high.fbx. And it's going to pull all the extra information that we have there, the extra geometry and stuff, and it's going to bake that onto the sides of this as an image. So the rest of this stuff I'm going to leave just default. If you're coming from Maya or something, you might use the match by name, so you'd have multiple meshes, for instance, your high and your low versions of different meshes, and you would match by mesh name. That kind of helps keep things from baking over top of each other. But in this case, since we're using UDIM tiles, I don't need to worry about that. So I'm going to click Bake All Texture Sets. All right, now that it's done, we'll click OK, and it'll jump back to our main material here. And we can see that it's now added a lot of this extra detail, like the panel lines, and it's also added what looks like the windows, even though if we come over to the side, we can see that those actually aren't there. Essentially what it's doing is it's using a normal map to tell the surface to kind of show shadows and highlights in different ways depending on the angle of these colors. So if we go into our materials, drop down up here, and scroll down to our mesh maps and look at the normal map, you can see kind of what it's doing. It's using this red, green, and blue to tell it to render light as if it's hitting the surface from different directions. So anything red is going to tell it that light should be hitting it from up here, whereas anything kind of blue-green is telling it that light should be hitting it from down here. We also have normals for the world space. So we have world space normals, which are a little different from our local space normals. We have, let's just go through these here real quick. We've got our normals, world space normals. We have our ID. So the colors that we had assigned to this before that we can use as masks are now kind of baked onto the side of this. We have our ambient occlusion, which is controlling where darker and lighter things should go, but also it's going to be used to control where kind of rust or dirt should accumulate, just like curvature. So curvature is another thing that's going to control where dust and where should accumulate. We've also got position, so in terms of where it is vertically or horizontally, the more green it is, for instance, we can use this position to kind of add things just at the top, but less down here towards the bottom. We also have thickness, so thickness is going to kind of control how round different parts should look and how massive they should look. And I don't think we have any others here, so let's go back up to the top, back to our base material. Let's go ahead and start adding some stuff to this. I'm going to go back to my layers here, and I'm going to be working on the fuselage first. I undid my names here, so let's go ahead and call this fins, and let's call that engine. I'm going to go ahead and go down to some of my smart materials. I have a bunch of different smart materials. I'm going to start with an aluminum and just drop that on the fuselage. And so by doing that, it's basically added this aluminum to the entire fuselage. Everything looks like it's aluminum. And if I open up this folder, you can see that it's got a couple of different parts. One is the scratches, which are the kind of noise and the messiness that gets applied to this. And then one down here is the aluminum base, which is actually the color of our aluminum and some of the other controls here. So using the aluminum base as an example, we're going to look at some of these different controls. In our properties, we've got color, height, normal, roughness, metal, and normal. We can also add additional properties to this, so we can go into our texture settings and we can add additional things like let's add emissive, for instance. So we can add an emissive channel here, and on the emissive channel we could add something that would basically make it glow a little bit. So if we add an emissive channel, this can make it look as if it's glowing, and then we can change that color and make it kind of a neon glow. This can actually be used to add lights in a renderer if you've got something that has a material that has an emissive channel. In this case, I don't really need that, so I'm just going to take that emissive channel back off. What we are going to use, though, are some of these other things. So like color, obviously this is going to be the base color of our material. We can change this color, make it more green metal, which is a little weird, or we can just keep it desaturated. And I think what I'm going to do with this is just make it a little bit darker aluminum, so something like that. We have our roughness. So the roughness is how kind of matte this is versus how shiny it is. If we increase the roughness, we can see that it's now very much just a diffused kind of material. But if we take the roughness down, now it becomes really, really reflective, and we can actually see the trees and the stuff in that environment light being reflected on the surface of this. So usually roughness is going to be some kind of a balance here, and you can kind of control this in different ways, and you can use different maps to control which areas are rougher and which areas are more smooth and reflective. Metallic, since this is a metal, this is kind of maxed out right now, but we can also take metallic off and turn it into just more of a matte, kind of a clay type texture. And then finally normal. If we add things to this, we could paint different shapes and stuff onto the side of this that would kind of appear like these windows appear right now. So there's our basic metal, and if I want to start adding some different things to this, different colors and stuff, I can do that with additional like fill layers and paint layers and stuff like that. So I can use additional materials. If I wanted to add like a colored aluminum, I can drop that down here. So I've got a whole new smart material, but maybe I only want that to affect certain parts. So this anodized aluminum, I can click on the add a mask, and I'm going to add any of these, or what I'm going to use is add mask with color selection, and that's going to let me choose one of my ID colors. So I come over here to pick a color. It temporarily switches into this kind of ID color scheme that we had from before. Now I can apply this anodized aluminum just to the spots where I had that red color. I could apply this also if I wanted to add additional things. I could add it to wherever I've got that yellow color as well. So now this anodized kind of aluminum is going to get applied to those. I can open this stuff up here and kind of control the different settings within this. So right now we've got the dust, and we also have the aluminum color. So if I wanted to change the aluminum anodized color to something like an orange, say, or a something else, we can do that. We can also lower the metallic look of this so that it's less kind of anodized looking and more of like a kind of a paint. We can adjust the dust. We can also adjust kind of how rough this entire thing is too. So if I don't want this to be quite so perfect and clean, if I want to roughen it up and add a little randomness to it, I can do that too. So with the aluminum, I could take this and add a white mask. And on that white mask, I can add a generator. So on our white mask, we can just drag one of our generators from here. So I can go down into my smart masks and say dust soft. Let's find this paint mask, and I'm just going to drag that on there. So I get this smart mask that's applied directly to this, and it's going to have like all these procedural scratches and stuff that we can now control dynamically. So it's basically, with some of these smart materials, they're really just a collection of other materials that have kind of been set up for us. So we have the mask editor, we've got the grunge scratches, and then we've got yet another grunge scratches, and these are all set up in different blend modes. So the mask editor at the base is in normal, and then each of these kind of subtract more from that because they're both set to subtract. We can change the way these work by setting it to pass through, or setting it to exclusion, or setting it to difference. These all do slightly different things, and you just kind of have to play around with them until you get the effect that you want. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and leave these both as subtract. On the mask editor, we've got some different controls here for our materials. So right now, you can kind of see, this is a good example here along this kind of false 3D rim right here. We know it's flat, but it still looks as if it's sticking out, and it's using that curvature Nebbian occlusion map to control where that paint goes. We can use blur to kind of blur out the roughness of this. We can use the global balance to adjust how much or how little wear and tear we get. We can adjust the global contrast. So if we use contrast, this doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot here, but we can make it so it has kind of harder edges or softer edges. We can adjust the texture opacity. Each of these settings on the mask editor do slight changes, and you kind of just, again, have to play around with them until you find what you like. We have ambient occlusion opacity, which the ambient occlusion is going to change how it works in surfaces or in areas where there's high ambient occlusion and where something is really dark. We don't have anything much for ambient occlusion right here, so it's kind of hard to see how that's going to work. We also have the curvature opacity, so if it's an area where with high curvature, this is going to be a lot more visible, whereas if it's an area with low curvature, it's not, and we can kind of turn that on and off here. We also have our world space normal, so we can control this based on where it is in space, if it's higher up or lower down. And Substance Painter really is just kind of different combinations of these masks, and you can pretty much just get things done with smart materials, but it's hard to get into this too much without just playing around with it and trying different things out. I'm going to go ahead and leave this here as is. I don't want to get too far into like grunge and scratches and stuff. We can add more of that later if we need to, but for now I want to go ahead and look at adding some of the other materials. So I'm going to start adding some of the glass materials here that I want to add just to the windows. For this is all going to go on the same material because it's all part of this fuselage here. What I'm going to do though is mask it again with an ID. So I'm going to go back to my smart materials. I'm going to search for glass, and I'm just going to use this glass. We can drop it there. You can see now it's kind of overlapping everything else that we've got. We could change our blend mode, so we could do subtract, and now we're getting some of the kind of like combination of metal and glass, which is a little weird. We could also go into linear dodge. By layering these materials over top of each other, you can get really interesting effects, but this isn't quite what I'm going for. I just want this to be actual kind of glassy looking stuff, and I just want it here on what's supposed to be the windows. So to get that to work, I'm just going to add another mask with color selection, and with the pick color, I'm going to set that to just right there. Now we can go into our glass visor settings for the base color. We can change that so we can make it more blue or more white. For this, I'm going to go ahead and leave it fairly dark actually, rather than making it super light like I just did. I'm going to go ahead and leave that fairly dark. I'm not going to bother making this transparent because we didn't set this up with like a knockout hole in the middle and like an interior to this, although we could, if we wanted to, go into our fuselage settings here in the main shader and our texture set settings and add an opacity channel. We would also have to go in and change our shader settings slightly. So instead of just this, we would need to add one that has actual ambient occlusion to it. So instead of the PBR metal rough here in our shader settings, we would need to change that to PBR metal rough with alpha blending so that we can actually see through. And so now that we've got that, we can actually see into the inside of this, which is okay. It's kind of weird because we're basically just seeing the inside of our rocket, including like the inside of the fins and stuff, but hey, it's still there. It still works, I guess, but we're not getting any kind of refraction because we're not really doing or we are getting refraction, but we're getting refraction based on the thickness of the entire ship, which is a little bit weird. So it makes it look like the entire thing is filled with glass, which is kind of strange, but we do have the option there, I guess, if we want it. We can also go up to our environment settings and turn up our opacity map, and now we can see through the windows to see our map on the other side. So there's that. And I'm going to zoom back out. Let's go ahead and turn this. For our display settings, let's turn our environment opacity back off. Just apply some different materials down here to the fins as well. For the fins, I think I'm going to do something slightly different. use one of these other kind of painted steels. So we can look at some of the other more complex materials. So with all of these, you can mouse over it and kind of get an idea of what it looks like. And really, again, you just kind of have to drag and drop and try different stuff out. Each of these has their own kind of set of things that you can control pretty quickly. I'm just going to drop one of these down. Let's try this green painted material. So we can, after we wait for it to apply, we can zoom in here a little bit. You can see this is a little bit more of a rough material, and if I open this up, let's go ahead and change this so it's kind of comparable to our other material here. So if I want to get that same, close to that same yellow, I can do that with the eyedropper. So I can click that, click the eyedropper, and drag over and release here, and it'll get close, but you can see that it's kind of too dark, so I'm just going to crank up the brightness. And let's crank up the saturation a little bit too. Now this, again, is kind of a slightly different material. It's got a lot of wear and a lot of roughness. It's got a little bit of a height to it, looks like, as well. And we've got different things here, like the surface details is just controlling height, really, and we can kind of adjust the roughness of that and adjust the height of our surface details. If we increase the height, we can make it look really rusted and really kind of jagged, or we can lower that and make it look less rusted and jagged. One thing that I do want to test out, so I'm going to go ahead and collapse this and turn it off and try one other material here that has some rust already on it. So machinery is a smart material that has this element of kind of like a rusted quality. And just to look at how it uses different maps in different ways, we want to see kind of how it applies rust based on our ambient occlusion. So it's typically going to use rust, and you use ambient occlusion to show rust just kind of here close to the fuselage, anywhere that it's really dark, and we can kind of expand this out. We get into our rust settings here, our mask editor for the rust. We can see that by changing the ambient occlusion effectiveness, it changes kind of how the rust gets placed on here. By default, it's maxed out, whereas curvature, typically on areas with high curvature, the water isn't going to pool there for very long, so that tends to run off. So curvature was actually a little bit lower. And then we can kind of adjust our global contrast and our global balance, so we can have more rust or less rust. And if we take the balance down, you can see that it really just leaves it anywhere that we have lots of ambient occlusion. So you want to be aware of that, kind of how it's using those to apply your materials. You also want to be careful not to apply to materials that don't seem to make sense together. So the rest of this I did in aluminum, which doesn't oxidize the same way that steel does. So having this steel oxidizing here on the edge, but not having any of that rub off the side of it doesn't really work out. So if you're going to have rust here, it probably makes sense to have some rust around there, but we need to add that rust material onto our fuselage as well and mask it out so it just shows up over here. Now, finally, if we want to paint things on here, we have lots of different alphas, and you can create different alphas and add them. Let's go ahead and turn both of these off, and I'm just going to use one of my aluminum materials. Again, we'll use our anodized aluminum, and go ahead and set the color for this to be something similar to what's already on there. Go ahead and set that to an orangey color and take our metallic down quite a bit. Let's go ahead and bring that just a little bit warmer, just like the other one. You can always copy and paste the RGB codes, but that's close enough. For now, I just want to be able to add like an alpha to this. Now let's go ahead and delete some of these other ones that I'm not going to be using and collapse this. I'm going to make a new layer. So we can add a new fill layer, we can add a new regular layer. I'm going to add a fill layer, and I want to change this. I want to add a paint to this. I'm going to add paint to this fill layer. Now, by adding a paint, it's going to let me actually paint. And if you use Wacom tablet, you can do that as well. Or if you want to be able to paint kind of like materials and stuff directly on. You could add a paint as a mask, for instance. So you take this off. If I wanted to paint this on directly, I could use add a mask with a, so select my mask and add a paint to the mask instead. So with this, I can actually mask out some of this stuff so it only shows up in certain areas. So we only get that anodized aluminum in certain areas. But what if you want to add something like on this fill layer? Let's turn this back on. I'm going to set the color to black. And on this fill layer, on this paint layer here, I want to paint something specific. So we can use different alphas, and you can actually load in different alphas if you want. And you can paint those directly on here. So I can stamp that on as a white stamp, just like that. You can also go into our symmetry settings if you wanted to do like a radial symmetry or something like that. Although I think with this, I don't know if it's going to work exactly the way we want. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit strange because the way our UVs are set up. But you can actually paint directly on here. If I have my Wacom tablet set up, you could also see some of the like pressure and kind of density controls, where you can just paint with a regular paintbrush. If you just go back to the regular alpha, which is way down here, buried towards the bottom. Nope, just past it. There we go. That's our alpha shape. And we can kind of control the hardness of this. We can control the spacing, so we can paint kind of patterns if we want to. We can also control the flow and the opacity, size, jitter, just like, again, just like painting with Photoshop, really. And then we also have the size space, which right now is based on object, so you can make it based on viewport or texture to kind of give you a little bit more control over how large this actually gets. We can give it a really hard brush too if we want, and lots of very little spacing, and we can kind of paint these in a little bit more carefully. And for the most part, this is pretty good at being able to paint directly on stuff in the viewport. If you've ever done any painting in something like Cinema 4D, you know how frustrating that was. But you can also see that it's running into some weird issues where it starts to paint kind of weird places and like jump around on me. And part of that is just the projection of where it's projecting the paint. If you want a little bit more control, you can go into the 2D and 3D and actually paint on the UVs, so that way you're not kind of painting directly on there. Let's turn off the radial symmetry as well, so that we can actually paint directly on here. And so by doing this, it gives you a little bit more control where these are actually going. And you can also change your alignment. So instead of painting based on tangent wrap, you can paint based on wherever the camera is looking, or you can paint based on whatever UV you happen to be looking at. For the most part, Substance Painter is really pretty self-explanatory beyond that. It's just a lot of trying out different materials and pasting things in different places, adding smart materials, and seeing where you can go from there. I'm going to go ahead and finish this out, and I will see you in the next video.